So, here we are on our third Sunday on Matthew's Gospel. And whilst not numerically in the middle, according to the number of chapters, we certainly arrive at quite a central point. Here, the opposition to Jesus' ministry starts to build. So who kicks off this opposition? Is it the Pharisees, King Herod, the Romans? No. John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin and co-worker. John, who is, if you remember, in prison, having angered King Herod with his fiery preaching and the condemnation of the king for marrying his brother's ex-wife. All of which was a part of John announcing that the kingdom of God was on the way, that Herod wasn't the real king, and that God would replace him. Doesn't take an awful lot of imagination, does it, to see why John might be in prison, why King Herod might not have been so happy. John was saying he couldn't do what he wanted to do, and that he wasn't the real king, that somebody else was going to come. But you see, John thought something different was going to happen. John is now in prison, disappointed. He had heard about what Jesus was doing, and it didn't sound like the Messiah he and God had rehearsed in his head. John was expecting Jesus to be a man of fire, an Elijah-like character who would sweep through Israel just as Elijah had dealt with the prophets of Baal. No doubt John was looking forward eagerly to the day that Jesus would confront Herod himself, topple him from his throne, become king in his place, and get his cousin out of prison. And perhaps even give his cousin a special place of honor at court. Jesus, though, has other ideas. It's almost as if he's playing to a different script altogether. He doesn't do any of those things. Matthew refers to what Jesus does as his messianic deeds, but John doesn't see it like that. Jesus was going around befriending tax collectors and sinners, people who strict Jews would regard as outsiders for not keeping the Torah properly. Jesus was gaining a great reputation, but not for doing what John wanted him to do. What was going on? Had John been wrong? Was Jesus, after all this, after all the pain he'd put himself to, living in the desert, eating honey and locusts, wearing uncomfortable clothes, and now being in prison, after all that, was Jesus not the one who was going to come? Now, I bet you're all sat there going, he's about to tell us that, of course, Jesus is the one to come. And yes, I am going to tell you that, but I'm also going to say no, he's not. For Jesus did believe that he was the one who was to come. He really was the Messiah, but he had rewritten the key bit of the play that John had in his head. To the surprise and consternation of all other people playing roles in this drama going on, Jesus was going back to a different script, a different kind of story. He wasn't thinking of himself in terms of Elijah calling down fire from heaven, like John wanted him to, but rather was thinking of passages like Isaiah 35, the great prophecies of what would happen when Israel was not so much judged and condemned, but restored after judgment. Exile would be over, the blind and lame would be healed. God's people would be set free at last. In other words, Jesus is one jump ahead in the storyline of where John thinks he should be. John wants him to bring judgment, and in a sense, Jesus will. But already, the mercy which comes after judgment, the healing which comes after the time of sorrow, is breaking in through Jesus. And it's Jesus' job to keep letting it break in, to usher in that new time. For according to Jesus, that is the Messiah's main task. It's a big, big surprise for John. John's not entirely sure that he likes it, for just as sometimes wicked people don't like the message of judgment because they think that it's aimed at them, which it probably is, so sometimes do good people not like the message of mercy because they think that people are going to get away with wickedness, which is not the case. Those people have to live with those decisions for the rest of their life, those actions. And Jesus' mercy was a huge surprise to John. It was not what he expected or what he wanted. John knew that Jesus' actions, as Jesus was following them, would not get him out of prison. And of course, those of us who have read a bit further and wider around the Bible than what we've heard today from our Pass the Parcel know that John doesn't ever leave prison, that he is beheaded while he is there. God does something different to what John is expecting. However, none of Jesus' words condemn John the Baptist. In fact, he's really complimenting John the Baptist. His message is basically that the time for the sort of work that John wants has come to an end. John did his job really, really well, but now the kingdom of heaven is here. It's coming in. If you think back all the way to chapter 4 of Matthew's Gospel, you will hear about Jesus calling his first disciples, beginning his ministry, beginning to announce the beginning of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven arriving on earth. Something else happens in chapter 4, and it is the arrest of John. Just as John is arrested, Jesus starts his ministry, starts to announce that the kingdom is here. In other words, Jesus is saying that the whole sweep and swathe of history that led up to John and his work was now being wound up. Not because it was a failure, but because it was a success. If the law and the prophets were looking forward to something that was yet to come, they are surely set aside when that new thing arrives. Not because they were wrong, and not because they haven't told the truth, but because they have. And because now that something that they have been telling is coming is here, that something new is going to tell you what's next. That something better is here. Essentially, Jesus is saying that Israel's long history, from Abraham and Moses through the prophets to the present time in John, was all one long preparation, one long getting ready time. John was the greatest preparer. He was really good at getting ready. He knew it was coming, and he was really good at telling everyone else that it was coming too. He did a really good job. But Jesus says, even the most insignificant person who accepts God's kingdom and lives by it is greater than John, because they are living in a different time, a time of fulfillment. In other words, Jesus says John was Elijah, one of the ones who was to come. John, you were the very fiery person of Elijah that you wanted, and I am the one who comes after the Elijah person. I am the person who comes next. And he says it in this cryptic way, knowing that those listening have been longing for this day for a very, very, very long time. For thousands of years. Well, for at least 8,000 years, probably longer. He knows that the stories of Elijah and what happens is well known. They're talked about. They're longed for. They're dreamt about. So he knows that by being cryptic, people are going to pick up on what he means, on what he's saying. And he chooses to be cryptic, to save some surprises, because he knows what will happen if he clearly owns up to being the Messiah. If he accepts the title of the King of the Jews at this point, then he might just share the same fate as John, to be a prisoner courtesy of King Herod, and perhaps even a dead prisoner. And his work's not done yet. Jesus reveals who he is then purely to those who are willing to listen, to those who have ears to hear. He is quite happy to go around and do his messianic things, his miracles, his healings, his casting out of demons, and he will do more. He is teaching on his own authority. He has chosen 12 disciples, a symbol of Israel's renewal. And he has sent them off on a mission to tell the whole country about him and his kingdom movement. But he's not going to tell the crowd this. He's going to let them make up their own minds. Because to declare his messiahship would be both dangerous and, in a strange way, all wrong. Because the sort of Messiah Jesus is trying to be, is wanting to be, isn't one who forces himself on people, but one who is available to people. We're here at the end of this chapter that he has a humble heart, happy to let people work it out for themselves. They have to decide who he is for themselves. I think we know, though, folks, don't we, that people aren't always very good at working things out for themselves. We can all be a bit slow at catching on from time to time. So our chapter continues with Jesus asking a question, pulling some people up short and trying to really make them think. Well, what were you expecting? You had John the Baptist. He led a life of self-denial, honey locusts, horrible itchy clothes in the desert. A bit like a holy ascetic in many traditions. But you found that hard to stomach. You didn't like it. You even suspected that a demon might have possessed him. And now here I am, Jesus says, celebrating the kingdom of heaven with all and sundry, throwing parties that speak of God's lavish, generous love and forgiveness, eating and drinking, and you accuse me of being a rebel, a glutton and a drunkard, a son who wouldn't behave, a false prophet. So what were you expecting? What are you expecting from God? And I think the answer, of course, is quite simple. People don't like challenge. They don't like someone like John who points out to them that they should live a different sort of life entirely. And they don't like it when someone like Jesus shows them that God's love is breaking through into the world in a new way, because new is scary. New is unknown. And they certainly don't like it when Jesus challenges them to turn away from the lives that they're comfortable in to join in with this new thing. So the words that follows, the words that feel harsh that he speaks to the cities, condemns them, tells them that they're worse than Sodom and Gomorrah, are among some of the most sober and serious words that Jesus will ever say. He had lived in Capernaum. After all, he knew the people. They were his friends, his neighbors. They were the baker where he bought his bread, the butcher, the people he met in the synagogue. And he knew that Chorazin and Bethsaida were just a short walk along the lakeside. And his heart goes out to them because he knew that they were bent on going their own way, following their own vision of God's kingdom. And he knew where it would lead. Their visions of revolutions, swords, spears, surprise attack, some hurt, some killed, winning in the end perhaps. Violence to defeat violence, a holy war against the unholy warriors. well, that only leads to more of the same. And so, Jesus says, better to be in Sodom and Gomorrah with fire and brimstone raining down from heaven than trying to fight God's battles with the devil's weapons. He is offering a last chance for these people to embrace a different kingdom vision. He'd outlined it in his great sermon and the teaching he was given in the towns and villages all over Galilee. He was living it out on the streets, in houses filled with laughter and friendship. He was showing how powerful it was with his healings, and they didn't want it. And they were ready to excuse it by any means necessary. Be it demon or rebellious son, the one our parents warned us about. Jesus looked out at them, looked at who was responding to his call and who wasn't. And he noticed a pattern. That the wise and learned were getting nowhere fast in understanding him or the new kingdom that was coming in with him. But the little people, or the people that others thought were little, is probably a better phrase. The poor, the sinners, the tax collectors, ordinary folk, seemed to be discovering more of God simply by following him. Jesus then realized that the learned specialists who declared what he was doing didn't fit with their complicated theories couldn't see. You see, the whole Jewish tradition, the traditions that the people had travelled with for years, for that millennium and more, spoke warmly about the wisdom of the wise. According to Jewish tradition, God gave wisdom to those who feared him. And so a long tradition of Torah study and piety indicated that those who devoted themselves to learning in the law and trying to tease out its finer points would become wise and would ultimately know God. And within that tradition, I think we can probably all appreciate where that puts God for ordinary folk, well out of reach. Because ordinary folk have got to go to work, they've got to feed their kids, they've got to earn enough money to feed the kids, to clean the house. There is not much time left for studying the Bible and sitting down with scholars and debating the meanings of particular words. So Jesus flips this little wisdom thing upside down. He says, don't worry about any of that, but rather come to me. Come and see who God the Father really is. Because God isn't about hours and hours of study and hard work. He appreciates hard work, don't get me wrong. But it's not about hours and hours of study. You don't have to put that in to just meet the guy. Honestly, God is here for everyone. And what Jesus began to realize, I think, in this little moment in our chapter, is that he was able to provide a window to God for people. And in inviting people to come to him, he was pulling back the curtain and unveiling the truth about God. The word for unveil here is apocalypse, which today still speaks of something dramatic, sudden and earth-shattering, doesn't it? I mean, I have lost count of the number of films that I see that are about apocalyptic events. That's a tongue twister if ever there was one. People are intrigued to know what will happen when certain things happen, if disasters happen, when the world is shaken and turned upside down. And well, by unveiling God, by pulling back the curtain, Jesus is saying this is exactly what's happening. Something different, radically different, is going to shake the world to its core. But come to me, Jesus says, Don't worry about hours and hours of study. Come to me instead. Receive rest. Rest from the religious rules of the Pharisees and their yoke to the Torah. I'm not going to do away with any of it, but come to me. Come and see who God is. Be inspired through a relationship with him, through me. And Jesus, being who Jesus is not going to stand over us like some sort of spiritual policeman. And he's not going to get cross like an angry school teacher when we haven't done our work, but is, through his gentle and humble heart, going to reveal God the Father to you who come to him. Come and take some rest. Stop trying so hard and let me show you what God is really like. Come have a relationship with him through me. Time and time again in this chapter, Jesus surprises the people around him. I think the question for us today is, are we ready to have our own assumptions about God and his kingdom challenged? Are we ready to be surprised? To discover who God really is? Do we want to really know who God is? Or are we a bit too comfortable that we want to go on believing that God is who we have made him out to be in our own minds? And that his plan is exactly in line with our plan. Our covenant service reminds us that sometimes what God plans align with us nicely, and sometimes they take us wildly in different directions. Are we willing to come to Jesus and peer through this window into God the Father to see what God is really like? Are we willing to embrace a life different to the world around? To choose the difficult actions of mercy and grace? To not pursue the guilty with harsh punishments, but methods of restoration, of restoring them to community and love? Are we willing to turn and do something altogether new? For God is a God of surprises. Are we ready to be surprised? I'm going to end by telling you a little story of when God surprised me. And if you were at the SLT away day yesterday, apologies, you heard it there. As a preacher, I quite often enjoy telling people that they need to be comfortable talking about God outside of the church building, with other people in the community. And I try to do it. Often, though, it is at times when I decide that I'm going to do it. There was one occasion, probably about a decade ago now, where I had been at the gym in Chippenham, where I was a youth worker, working for the church. And I'd gone to the changing rooms afterwards and was having a shower because I was hot and sticky and smelly. And I got in the shower, was having a wash, there was nobody else there, and it was great. Suddenly, in walks an older gentleman who is also going to take a shower. Now, gentlemen, you'll probably appreciate this. There is, I think, some level of decorum and understanding about which urinals you use, which cubicles you use, and which showers you use when you go in when there's just a row of them. And the answer is never the one right next to the person who's the only other one in that row. Well, this gentleman clearly had never heard of that rule, because he came and got in the shower right next to mine. And whilst I still had some shorts on in the shower, he was not quite so reserved. And he also didn't understand that if you don't know somebody in the showers and in the changing rooms for men, you don't talk to them, because the next thing he did was say hello. My heart is going a million miles an hour. I do not feel very comfortable. What on earth is going on here? He asked me what I do. I say I work for the church. And he says, I gave up on all of that a long time ago. Tells me a long story about why, which I can relate to be fair. And I say, well, this is why I do it. This is the love I find. And at the end of it, I'm very glad to run away from the showers. But just before I do run away, he says, I'm really glad there are people like you in the world who still have hope and who are still able to see a future filled with love and peace. And I just want to say, what a God incidence. What a way that God surprised me. He brought somebody into my life for a fleeting moment. And he was able to touch my spirituality, and I hope that he left feeling a little bit uplifted and aware that there were people who still had a hope and carried the torch of light. And of course, we would say Christ. What would have happened if I hadn't have been so open to talking in that shower? What would have happened if I hadn't have been aware that God had made that moment just so special? God sometimes surprises us in the most strangest of ways, in the most awkward of places, and at the weirdest of times. Are we ready to be surprised by God? Are our eyes ready to see new things? And are our ears ready to hear? Because God's love is a wondrous thing, awe-inspiring. So our next song is May I Never Lose the Wonder.